The unplanned life of Nicholas Rivers. The chilly morning air bit at Elias Thorne's cheeks as he strode through the park, his daily 7:05 a.m. ritual. He was a creature of habit, a billionaire CEO who had meticulously crafted a life of precision and control. Every morning, he walked the same path, coffee in hand, headphones on, moving fast enough to avoid small talk and slow enough to avoid a sweat. This wasn't a scenic stroll. It was a commute, a perfectly calibrated segment of a perfectly calibrated life. But that morning, his routine was brutally, unyieldingly shattered. A flicker of movement to the side of the path caught his eye, a slumped form on a park bench beneath a row of bare trees. He almost walked past, as he always did. But something was wrong with the stillness. A woman's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her shoulders slack. And beside her, two small figures sat huddled together, their faces streaked with tears, tiny hands gripping each other tightly. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Their clothes were too thin for the cold, and their feet were bare. Elias stopped. The joggers ran by. A man on a bike glanced at them and kept going. Elias, however, was rooted to the pavement, his carefully managed pulse now hammering in his chest. A cold, sudden dread took hold as he stared at the children. Those eyes, that messy dark hair, the shape of their faces. It was more than just that they were twins. It was something that twisted his gut into a knot. It was like looking at a smaller, more fragile version of himself. Unmistakably, unignorably familiar. He walked over slowly, crouching in front of the bench. The children looked up at him with wide, wet eyes, but they didn't flinch. The woman was unresponsive. Elias gently touched her shoulder. "Ma'am?" he asked softly. There was no reply. Her skin was cold, her breath shallow but steady. He pulled out his phone and immediately dialed for emergency services. While he waited, he shrugged off his expensive wool coat and draped it over her. Then he took off his sweater and wrapped it around the two shivering children. They clung to each other, not speaking, until one of them, the slightly taller one, whispered. She was tired. She just wanted to rest a little. The other child added, "We were waiting for Dad, but he didn't come." The last word was a choked sob. A sudden sharp ache hit Elias in the chest. He looked at them again. Blue eyes, dark curls, a carbon copy of his own features. The paramedics arrived moments later. They asked questions, loaded the woman onto a stretcher, and checked the children for illness or injury. Elias answered what he could, which wasn't much. He didn't know her name, what had happened, or how long they had been there. But when a paramedic turned to ask his relation to the children, Elias didn't hesitate. "I think," he said slowly, barely able to form the words, "I think I'm their father." No one questioned him further. The children didn't correct him. They simply took his hands as they were led to the ambulance. Elias, who had spent his entire adult life building a fortress around his heart and his schedule, followed without a second thought. He had no idea what came next. But for the first time in years, he let life interrupt his plan. And it started with a woman from his past and two little children who looked just like him, waiting for someone who hadn't come. Until now. Do you think Elias's immediate reaction to claim the children was driven by instinct, or was it a calculated decision based on their resemblance? A new reality. The hospital waiting room was too bright, too cold, too quiet. Elias sat on a rigid plastic chair, his elbows on his knees, fingers tightly laced together. He couldn't stop replaying the last hour, finding her on the bench, the children huddled together, the way one of them had looked at him, as if he was supposed to know what to do. He didn't. Not really. He hadn't seen Eleanor in nearly 5 years. He had convinced himself he hadn't thought about her face in a long time, But the moment he saw her, it all came rushing back. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she talked with her hands when she got passionate. And now she was unconscious in a hospital bed. And those two children, those children with his eyes, were asleep in a bassinet in the next room. A nurse walked by and gave him a gentle look, the kind reserved for people trying to look calm when they are anything but. He thanked her silently and got up to stretch, unsure of what he was even waiting for. He had no legal status, no paperwork, no proof, just a profound certainty and a voice in his head replaying what the small child had said. We were waiting for Dad, but he didn't come. He didn't know how long they'd been waiting. He didn't know how long Eleanor had been ill. He knew nothing that mattered, and the guilt was beginning to burn under his skin. He had left her. Not cruelly, not dramatically. He had simply walked away. They had been happy for a time. It was real. But when his career took off, he chose ambition over her. She hadn't fought him. She had simply faded away. Now he knew why. The doctor came out around noon. Elias stood up quickly, his heart pounding. She's stable, the doctor said. Exhaustion, malnutrition, dehydration. She's been under significant physical and emotional stress for a long time. Elias asked if she was awake. Not yet, the doctor replied. But soon. And when she does wake, we'll need someone she trusts. Elias wasn't sure if that was him anymore. He went to the small room where the children had been taken. They were curled together in a hospital crib, wrapped in a blanket that was too thin for comfort. A nurse had given them juice boxes and crackers, and the tray sat untouched beside them. Elias sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. He didn't want to scare them. After a while, one of the children, Leo, stirred. His eyes opened slowly, still puffy from crying. Is she okay? He asked softly. She's going to be, Elias answered, matching the quietness of his tone. Leo blinked, then looked at his brother still sleeping beside him. Are you really our dad? Elias froze. There were 1,000 ways to answer that question. He could ask for a DNA test. He could deny it until he had proof. But none of that mattered to Leo in that moment. What mattered was if someone would stay. I think so, Elias said. Leo nodded once, then scooted a little closer to him, before closing his eyes again. Later, when Eleanor awoke, a nurse came to get him. Elias walked into her room slowly, unsure of what she would say, or what he would say. She looked smaller than he remembered, her frame thinner, her cheeks hollowed out with exhaustion, but her eyes still held that same fire when they met his. I guess you found us, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wasn't looking, he admitted, but I'm here. She studied him for a long moment. You weren't supposed to know. I know now. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, as if holding something back. When she opened them again, her voice was stronger. They don't know who you are. Not really. I didn't tell them. I wasn't sure you'd ever care. Elias took a breath. I didn't know. If I had known. She raised a hand, weak but firm. Don't say that. What's done is done. He nodded, swallowing the 1,000 things he wanted to say. Then he asked the only thing that truly mattered. What do you need from me? Eleanor turned her head toward the window. For a moment, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said in a quiet voice, Don't disappear. He moved closer to the bed. I won't. And for the first time since that morning in the park, Elias wasn't thinking about his next meeting or the messages piling up on his phone. He was thinking about those two children and the woman who had carried it all alone, and he was thinking about what it meant to finally stay. Reflect on the moment Elias meets Eleanor again. What do you think is a more powerful emotion for him at that moment? Guilt over the past or a sense of responsibility for the present? Building a new foundation, the next few days passed in a strange, quiet blur. Elias stayed at the hospital. He'd arrive early, leave late, and spend hours just sitting nearby. Sometimes in the hallway outside Eleanor's room. Sometimes reading picture books to the children in the pediatric waiting room. He canceled meetings without a second thought and stopped answering most of his emails. His assistant, who had worked with him long enough to know not to ask questions, sent out short replies to clients and board members. Mr. Thorne is currently dealing with a personal emergency. It was the truth, but it didn't even begin to explain what was happening. Eleanor's recovery was slow. Her body responded first. Fluids, food, rest. But emotionally, she kept her distance. She let Elias be around, but there was a wall between them now, built of years of silence and decisions that couldn't be undone. She didn't thank him for staying, and he didn't expect her to. They both understood that this wasn't about them anymore. It was about two children who had spent too long waiting for someone to show up. The first night she was well enough to sit up, they talked. Not about the past, not about the whys, but about the children. Their names, their habits, the way Leo refused to eat vegetables unless you called them little trees, the way Julian liked to sleep with his feet sticking out from under the blanket no matter how cold it was. Elias listened intently, memorizing everything. He realized how much he had missed. First steps, first words, birthdays, crayon drawings, sick days. It had all happened without him, and the weight of that was crushing. Eleanor explained that she hadn't wanted to completely exclude him. At first, she had been angry, then scared, and then, with time, the idea of contacting him became more complicated than silence. Life had swallowed her up. 2 babies, no support system, bills she could barely manage, jobs that barely paid. She had done what she could. She didn't say it like she wanted pity. She said it like it was a fact. And that, more than anything, made Elias want to step in and carry some of that weight now. He arranged for them to temporarily move into a safe, furnished apartment closer to the hospital, while Eleanor regained her strength. It wasn't his penthouse. It wasn't luxurious. But it was clean, warm, and had a view of a small park where the children could play. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't ask what it cost or who was paying for it. She just nodded, exhausted and grateful in the most silent way. The children quickly adjusted to their new space. For kids who had seen so much uncertainty, they latched onto routine like a lifeline. Elias became part of that routine. He'd take them for walks, help with bedtime, watch cartoons that made no sense to him, but made them laugh hysterically. At first it was awkward. He felt like a guest in his own story. But then, something began to shift. Leo started calling him Nick without hesitation. Julian began saving drawings for him. One morning, when he arrived late after a conference call he couldn't avoid, both boys ran to him at the door as if he'd been gone for days. That moment nearly broke him. One night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor stood beside Elias in the tiny kitchen, making tea. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with something else. Respect, perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. She passed him a mug and said, "They like you." She didn't know how they'd react, but they were drawn to you, as if they just knew. Elias stared into the mug, his voice lower than usual. "I'm scared of messing this up." Eleanor gave him a tired smile. "Good. That means you care enough to try." And he did care, more than he thought he was capable of. He had lived his life in skyscrapers, surrounded by power and precision, always in control. But none of that had prepared him for this, for the sticky fingers and the bedtime tears and the aching desire to be worthy of something real. He hadn't earned their love yet, but he was beginning to understand what it would take. Not perfection, not promises, just presence. And for the first time, he wanted nothing more than to stay exactly where he was, from control to connection. Elias had always measured progress in outcomes, spreadsheets, milestones, quarterly targets. It was how he made sense of the world. But fatherhood refused to follow a formula. Some days felt like breakthroughs, others felt like failures. A morning would begin with giggles and end in tantrums over mismatched socks. Still, the changes, though subtle, were undeniable. The children grew more comfortable around him, and he, in turn, was becoming someone they looked for in a room. Someone they turned to when they were tired, or upset, or just wanted to share a silly joke. Elias found himself checking on them at night, not because he had to, but because he needed the reassurance that they were safe and real and still here. Eleanor was slowly recovering, both physically and emotionally. The dark circles under her eyes faded with each day of rest, and the stiffness in her voice softened during their late-night conversations. She didn't talk about the hardest years she had lived, unless he asked. But when she did, it was factual. There were nights with no heat, weeks with barely enough food, moments when she had considered giving up entirely. She told him the only thing that kept her going was the way the children looked at her, as if she were enough, even when the world told her she wasn't. Elias listened, humbled by how easily he had forgotten her strength, how completely he had underestimated what it had cost her to raise his children alone. He offered help cautiously, not wanting to overstep. He gave her space when she needed it, support when she accepted it, and made it clear every day, in small ways, that he wasn't going to disappear again. It wasn't about grand statements. It was about showing up, about doing the dishes without being asked, about sitting through the same cartoon 5 times in a row, about bringing her tea when he knew she wouldn't ask for it. And slowly, Eleanor began to let him in. The children began to ask questions too, the kind Elias wasn't sure how to answer. One night, Julian asked why he hadn't been there when they were born. Leo wanted to know if Elias had other children somewhere else. Elias sat with them on the living room floor, trying to find the right words. He told the truth as best he could. He said he hadn't known they existed, and if he had, he would have come sooner. He said he had made mistakes, that adults sometimes did, and that he was trying every day to be better because they mattered more than anything. The boys didn't respond immediately, but later that night, Julian slipped a drawing under Elias's door. It was the 3 of them, stick figures with big smiles, standing under a blue sky, with the word Dad scrawled above his head in bright red crayon. Elias kept it on his nightstand from that night on. His days found rhythm. Mornings were still chaotic, full of cereal spills and lost shoes, but they were also full of sleepy smiles and small hands reaching for his. Evenings meant story time, teeth brushing with too much toothpaste, and the quiet ritual of watching the boys fall asleep. Elias didn't miss the life he had before, not the glass-walled office, not the constant pressure to outperform, not even the accolades. None of it compared to the feeling of 2 small heads resting on his shoulders as he read the same picture book for the 3rd night in a row. One afternoon, Eleanor stood by the window, watching the children play in the park below the apartment. She didn't speak right away. Elias joined her, his arms crossed, his heart steady. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "They're going to remember this. Not the hospital, not how tired I was. They're going to remember that someone came for them." He nodded, unsure if he could speak past the knot in his throat. She turned to him, her eyes tired but clear. "So don't disappear. Not now. Not again." "I won't," he said, and he meant it. And in that moment, with the sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of laughter rising from the street below, Elias understood something he never had before. Love wasn't something you waited to feel. It was something you chose to give, over and over, even when it scared you. Especially then. He wasn't trying to make up for the past anymore. He was building something new, and for the first time in his life, he didn't need a plan to do it. What do you think is the biggest difference between the Elias we meet at the beginning of the story and the Elias who is building a new life with Eleanor and the children? A battle worth fighting. Elias didn't realize how deeply he had changed until the outside world finally caught up. The temporary apartment had become a sanctuary of sorts, messy and loud and full of warmth, but it was never meant to be permanent. He'd told himself they were just settling in, giving Eleanor time to heal and the boys time to adjust. But over a month had passed, and everything about his old life now felt distant, like a version of himself that belonged to someone else. His phone still buzzed with reminders from meetings he no longer attended, emails from investors, messages from old colleagues asking if he was coming back to reclaim his spot. He didn't reply to most of them, and when he did, his answers were brief and definitive. Not now. It's not important. He wasn't interested in maintaining a life he no longer recognized, but not everyone was willing to let go so easily. One morning, as he was helping the boys put on their shoes for a walk to the park, he got a call from his lawyer. Eleanor's ex-boyfriend, a man named Victor, had petitioned for visitation rights, claiming he had been a father figure to the children and should be allowed to see them. Elias felt a surge of cold fury the moment he heard the name. Eleanor had only mentioned Victor once in passing, and the discomfort in her voice said everything. He hadn't been involved in their raising. He hadn't provided, or protected, or stayed. And now that things were beginning to stabilize, he wanted to reappear. Elias didn't tell Eleanor right away. He didn't want to worry her, not while she was still fragile in ways she tried hard to hide. Instead, he met with his legal team to prepare. His business world instincts kicked in. Gather information, build a case, anticipate every angle. But this wasn't business. This was family. And for the first time in his life, Elias wasn't fighting for profit, but for the right to continue being a part of something he didn't even know he was missing. When he did tell Eleanor, her reaction was quiet and intense. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands tightly wrapped around a coffee mug, her eyes fixed on a crack in the tile. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just said, "He wants control. He never wanted them. He just wants to be right." Elias nodded. "Then we show them what's true, what the boys know, what you and I know." The boys, of course, sensed the tension, even if they didn't understand it. Leo became more withdrawn, needing extra time at bedtime to fall asleep. Julian asked questions that made Elias pause, like, "Are we going to have to leave again?" Or, "Am I still your dad, if someone else wants to be?" Elias knelt down to answer those questions honestly, carefully. He promised that no matter what happened in court, he wouldn't leave, that they were his boys, not just in name, but in every decision he made now. And both boys, in their own way, seemed to believe him. The court date came sooner than anyone expected. Elias wore a simple suit, no tie, his nerves visible only in the way he clenched his jaw. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand brushing his as the hearing began. Victor arrived with a lawyer and a prepared statement, painting himself as a misunderstood man who had supported Eleanor for years, who deserved a role in the children's lives. But when the judge pressed him, he stumbled. He couldn't remember the boys' birthdays. He didn't know the name of their school. He had no proof of financial support or personal involvement. His version of love was theoretical. Elias's was lived. The most powerful moment came when the judge asked if the children had expressed any wishes. A court-appointed child advocate had met with them privately, and what she shared was simple. Leo had said, "Nick reads to us even when he's tired. He makes pancakes even when they burn." Julian had said, "He came for us. That's how we know he's our dad." Elias didn't cry. But when the judge ruled in his favor, denying Victor's petition and acknowledging Elias as the boy's legal father, something in him shifted. It wasn't victory he felt. It was gravity. A quiet, permanent responsibility that had already been growing in his heart, now solidified by law. Back home, the children celebrated in the only way they knew how, by making a giant blanket fort and dragging Elias inside. They piled stuffed animals on his chest, turned out the lights, and whispered, "We're safe now." And Elias believed them. Not because the court said so, but because this time he had stayed. What do you think is the deeper meaning behind Julian saying, "He came for us. That's how we know he's our dad"? Building a family, not a fortress. The days after the hearing passed in a quiet exhale. There were no fireworks, no big celebrations, just a deep, steady sense of relief that settled into every corner of their lives. The children didn't fully understand the legal victory, but they understood the feeling of safety, of stability. They laughed more freely, slept more soundly, and no longer asked Elias if he'd still be there tomorrow. He was now part of the routine, not a guest or a stranger, but a permanent fixture in the home they were slowly building together. Elias moved them out of the temporary apartment and into a small house on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't extravagant, but it had a backyard, 3 bedrooms, and sunlight in every room. Eleanor picked out the curtains. The boys chose their wall colors. Leo wanted blue. Julian chose green. And Elias spent an entire weekend assembling bunk beds, swearing under his breath, while the boys watched and offered completely useless advice. In the end, the house wasn't perfect. The dining room chairs didn't match, and there were fingerprints on every window, but it felt alive. It felt like theirs. Elias began waking up before the children, not because he had meetings or deadlines, but because he wanted to. He liked being the first one up, liked making coffee in a quiet kitchen, and listening to the soft sound of the morning around him. He liked hearing the sound of little footsteps pattering down the hallway. Julian's sleepy, high-pitched "Dad," the way Leo would lean against him for a few minutes before fully waking up. These were the moments he never knew he needed. The slow, simple, unglamorous pieces of a life that felt more real than anything he had ever built before. Eleanor had started painting again. At first, it was just to pass the time while the boys were at school. But soon it became something more. Elias set up a small studio for her on the sun porch, and whenever he walked by, she was there, barefoot, a paintbrush in her hand, lost in a world of color. He didn't ask what she was painting. He just let her have that space, in the same way she had given him the chance to prove himself, to belong here, not through words, but through presence. They never defined what they were to each other. They didn't need to. Some nights they would sit on the porch and say nothing, sharing a blanket and a mug of tea, watching the boys chase fireflies in the yard. Other nights, they would talk for hours about anything and everything. Elias found himself opening up in ways he never had before, not just about his past mistakes, but about his fears, his guilt, and the quiet joy he felt now, that he never thought he would deserve. One night, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Leo pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of his backpack. It was a drawing of their house, with crooked windows and smoke coming out of the chimney. He had drawn himself, Julian, Eleanor, and Elias, standing out front, all holding hands. Above them, in large, wobbly letters, he had written, "Family." Elias stared at it for a long time. He wasn't a man who was easily moved, but something about that drawing hit him harder than any court decision or business deal. He realized then that this wasn't about redemption or proving anything. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building something new, something strong enough to hold them all. That night, as he tucked the boys into bed, Julian looked at him and asked, "Do you miss your old job?" Elias thought for a moment, then smiled. "Not one bit," he said, "because this messy, loud, beautiful life is more than I ever thought I would have. And more than that, it was exactly where he wanted to be. A new season, a new truth." Autumn arrived gently that year, coloring the trees outside their new home in warm shades of amber and gold. The crisp air brought new routines, morning jackets, packed lunches, and the excitement of school days, which began with laughter and often ended with sticky fingers from after-school snacks. Elias had adapted to his role as a father in ways that even surprised him. He no longer second-guessed himself when it came to the small, day-to-day decisions. He packed their bags without needing a checklist. He knew which socks Leo hated and could predict Julian's moods based on what he chose for breakfast. There was a rhythm now, an imperfect but real one, and Elias had learned to trust it. Eleanor had started teaching a community art class twice a week at a nearby center. She'd come home smelling faintly of oil paint, her cheeks flushed, and her eyes bright in a way Elias hadn't seen since before the hospital. He never said it, but he watched her more closely these days, not out of concern, but out of a quiet admiration. Her resilience humbled him. She had carried it all alone for so long, and now that she didn't have to, she was beginning to bloom again. He gave her space when she needed it, and support when she accepted it. And slowly, the bond between them deepened. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, not yet, but it was rooted in something stronger. Shared trust, mutual respect, and the unspoken understanding of two people who had weathered a storm and were still standing. One Sunday morning, the boys came rushing into the kitchen, holding flyers from school. The fall festival was coming up, and they wanted Elias to volunteer. There was going to be a costume contest, a pie-eating race, and something called the Pumpkin Dad Dash, which involved running across a field while balancing gourds on your head. Elias groaned, but agreed, and when the day came, he showed up in a full costume, an oversized pumpkin suit that barely fit his shoulders. The boys were delighted. Eleanor laughed until she cried, and Elias realized he would wear 1,000 ridiculous things just to see their faces light up like that again. The festival proved to be more than just a fun distraction. It became a moment of quiet realization. While Elias was at the snack booth, holding 2 sticky caramel apples and trying to wipe mustard off of Leo's face, he noticed how naturally he fit into this world now. Other parents nodded at him. Some stopped to chat. Teachers waved at them with genuine smiles. He was no longer just a guest in the boys' lives. He was a part of the community, part of the fabric of their daily life. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Elias and Eleanor sat in the living room. The soft sound of crickets drifted in from the open window. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move. He simply breathed her in and felt the weight of the moment settle around them. She whispered, "You've changed." He looked at her, his eyes soft. I had to. No, she said softly. You chose to. That distinction mattered. He hadn't been forced into fatherhood. No court order or scandal had dragged him into this. He had made a choice the moment he stopped in that park, the moment he walked toward the bench instead of past it. And every step since then had been another choice. To stay, to fight, to grow. He thought of that first day often, not because he regretted it, but because it reminded him how close he had been to missing everything that mattered. The boys had never asked for a perfect father. They just needed one who would show up. And now, when he looked at their faces, he saw trust. He saw joy. He saw belonging. As the fire in the living room crackled low and Eleanor's breathing slowed beside him, Elias realized that what they had built together wasn't just healing. It was a life, one that was worth every sacrifice, one that was worth protecting. And for the first time in what he could remember, he no longer felt like he was running from anything. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. A winter of contentment. Winter came gently that year. It wasn't harsh or biting, but quiet and full of moments that felt suspended in time. The snow began to fall before the holidays, blanketing the neighborhood in a soft, white silence that made everything feel slower and more intimate. Elias found himself waking up before the boys, just to watch the world outside his window turn pale and bright. It was the kind of season he used to ignore completely, buried in meetings, deadlines, and constant travel. But now he welcomed it, because it meant more time inside, with the people who had become his entire world. The house was filled with warmth and noise. The boys made paper snowflakes and taped them to every surface they could find. Eleanor baked cookies that never looked quite right, but were always gone before they cooled. Elias bought a real Christmas tree for the first time in his adult life, and the boys helped him decorate it. Half the ornaments clustered near the bottom, all the lights tangled, but perfect in its imperfection. They watched holiday movies under a blanket, drank cocoa with too many marshmallows, and spent snowy afternoons building lopsided snowmen in the backyard. It wasn't picture perfect. There were still bedtime arguments, spilled juice, and laundry that piled up faster than it could be folded. Elias still had moments where he second-guessed himself, where the weight of the responsibility hit him hard. But those moments didn't last. They were replaced by others. Julian falling asleep on his chest after a long day, Leo asking for help with a school project, Eleanor reaching for his hand when she thought no one was looking. These were the things he had never known he wanted, the kind of fulfillment that didn't come with titles or power, but with being present. On New Year's Eve, they didn't go out or host a party. They stayed home, just the four of them, in pajamas and mismatched socks. The boys were determined to stay up until midnight, though Julian was out by 10 and Leo only made it to 11. Elias and Eleanor sat together on the couch, a quiet playlist humming in the background, watching the fire burn low in the hearth. She turned to him at one point, her voice soft and sure, and said, "This is the life I dreamed of," when it felt impossible. Elias didn't speak right away, just looked at her, and then at the photos that now adorned the mantel. The boys in the park, Eleanor painting in the sunlight, the four of them at the fall festival, laughing. "Me too," he said finally. "I just didn't know it." Midnight came and went without fanfare. There were no fireworks or champagne, just the two of them, sitting in the stillness of a house they had filled with something real. As he carried the boys to bed, one at a time, Elias paused in their doorway and took in the sight of them, curled up under dinosaur blankets, cheeks flushed with sleep. He had no idea what the future held. There would be challenges, mistakes, probably heartache at times, but there would also be growth and joy, and the kind of love that holds steady, no matter how messy things got. He walked into the hallway and turned off the light, the soft sound of their breathing behind him. When he reached the living room again, Eleanor was still on the couch, a book in her lap, her eyes heavy with sleep. He sat beside her and pulled the blanket over them both. She leaned into him without a word, and in that moment, Elias understood something he hadn't before. Life hadn't given him a second chance. It had given him his first real one, not the version built on ambition or control, but the one built on connection, on forgiveness, on the quiet moments that meant everything. He hadn't planned any of this, but it was his, all of it, and he would never let it go. What do you believe is the single most important lesson Elias has learned throughout this journey? Call to action. What was your favorite moment in the story? Let me know, and we can explore it further. Or, if you have another story you'd like me to write, just send it over. I'm ready to start the next adventure with you.